President Trump's threats to use the military to break up protests and the actual use of force to clear peaceful protesters near the White House has led to a torrent of criticism from former military leaders, including multiple defense secretaries, chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and yes, NATO commanders. Among those voices of protest was retired Admiral James Stavridis, the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, and he joins me now. Admiral, welcome to Meet the Press. Why did you feel so compelled to speak out, and why do you think so many of your fellow four stars, if you will, felt the need to speak out this week?
At the end of the day, Chuck, everybody in the military swears an oath every time they are promoted in rank. I did it as a midshipman at the Naval Academy and again up to four-star admiral. That oath is to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. This is a moment when I think many of us watched the use of active duty military to clear peaceful protesters out of Lafayette Square, and it rang echoes of what the founders feared more than anything, which was the use of armed active duty military against citizens. And they built safeguards in, including the First Amendment. So I think the spectrum that kind of runs from very reticent, Jim Mattis, John Kelly, who were part of this administration, to people like me kind of in the center, to people like General John Allen and Admiral Bill McRaven, who've been quite critical, that whole spectrum jumped and felt that shock of watching active duty troops clear peaceful protesters. Wrong answer.
I'm curious, it struck me today, being NATO Supreme Allied Commander, you didn't live in the United States, you lived overseas. Being an American diplomat overseas that, say, in Hungary, say, in China, say, in Brazil, you get where I'm going here. Are you concerned about our loss of international moral authority?
I am, Chuck, and often before I was NATO commander, I spent 4 years, 4 stars, in charge of all military south of the United States. It's called U.S. Southern Command. So I spent a lot of time with the governments and the militaries of Latin America and the Caribbean, who, let's face it, have a long history of dictatorships and repression. They've come a long way since the 60s and 70s, but I spent a lot of time talking to those leaders, making sure that they continued on that path. I never thought I would be criticizing my own government in that regard. It's a shocking turn. And to your point, yes, it reduces our moral influence and our leadership role in the world. We had to worry about that deeply.
If you're Secretary Esper or General Milley, who clearly, they have tried to draw a line of distance now in what happened last Monday night. At the end of the day, though, they have to follow a commander-in-chief's order. So if he does want to invoke the Insurrection Act, what would you advise Secretary Esper or General Milley to do?
I think two slightly different cases, Chuck. Of course, Secretary Esper, although he's a West Point graduate himself and was on active duty in the military at one time, he's a political appointee. He's kind of signed up for this to a certain degree, but I was pleased to see him push back on the president during the course of the week and say he would not recommend the Insurrection Act. General Milley, very different situation. As an active duty officer, he's really got two choices here. One is to follow the orders, and the other is to reach up onto his shoulder, grab those 4 stars, and say, sir, I cannot execute that order. I believe it violates my conscience, my view. I gave you my best military advice. You've rejected it. That's a very hard place for any active duty military officer to go. I hope General Milley doesn't have to hit that point.
Are you concerned about morale at the Pentagon, morale in the rank and file?
I am. And here we get into simply the numbers involved here. In this country, we have about 1 million police officers. We have 500,000 National Guard who are citizen soldiers who operate under authority of governors. My view, that's plenty of people who can do the policing function, and their real role is to protect these peaceful demonstrators. This is not a battle space to be dominated. These are zones of protest to be protected. There are sufficient forces to do that, and I think the military is very concerned about getting pulled into the maelstrom of politics in an election year in order to push protesters as they were at Lafayette Square. That was wrong.
Admiral James Stavridis, really appreciate you coming on, sharing your perspective and expertise with us from your point of view. Thanks for being here. Hello from Washington, I'm Chuck Todd, and thanks for checking out the Meet the Press channel on YouTube. Click on the button down here to subscribe and click over here to watch the latest interviews, highlights, and other digital exclusives.